Let's have a look at us. I think we're live there with Chief Censor David Shanks. That's us. We're live. Hello.
Kia ora, Pat.
Oh, kia ora. Thank you for coming in and Oti joining us down here in Dunedin for a wee bit of time. I hope you enjoy your time while you are here. And thank you for giving me some time as well.
It's great to be here, Pat. I was a student down here many years ago in the 80s, and it's great to be back down in Dunedin and seeing such a beautiful day you've got outside.
Yeah, it's
actually hot.
It's a cracker, and it was a cracker yesterday. We've had a few good ones, actually. It's been quite a nice couple of days. It's those days where I'm lucky enough that I work from home, that I've got a little kind of leatherette chair upstairs with and I go up there with my laptop and I sit by the window and just look at the blue sky and count my blessings.
Yeah, not bad, eh?
Hey, now you are New Zealand's chief censor. Other than kind of looking around and seeing what the chief censor does for me, I reckon that your work probably, it's always difficult because maybe it's not everybody, but probably affects every person in New Zealand every single day of their lives. If not, certainly massive majority of the time, massive majority of the days. But I don't reckon many people really know much about what you actually do and what the job is. And so I thought when I saw you coming to Dunedin, let's have this conversation. This just sounds like a fun chat to learn more about it. And the more I've been looking into what you do, the more, I don't know, the freakier it is. It's not the right word, but the more I'm kind of just to realise how much you go into our lives, society's lives, and what you're doing. So how about we start by just kind of going, what is the role of the chief censor day to day? What is what's on your business card?
Yeah, look, for sure, and you're right in many respects. There's aspects of what I do that does touch everyone's lives in some way, in all sorts of ways. But the thing is, that's the curious thing about it, isn't it? As you point out, is that it's kind of invisible. Like, what is going on, and how does it affect people's lives, and how does it all work? And I've got to say, I appreciate the opportunity to talk about that because I think it is something that needs better understanding. I'm really quite hot on actually getting people understanding what's going on because, interestingly enough, while I'm New Zealand's chief censor, and I think once upon a time many countries had a chief censor. Today, I think I'm possibly one of the last official chief censors nominated as such in the Western world.
But does that mean that the role is just because the word censor, I don't know if that's particularly helpful to you because most people think of censorship as a bad thing. Is it just because the rest of the world are kind of re-evolving how that's looked at, but they do sort of the same job?
That's exactly right. I mean, I went to an international classifiers conference shortly after I became. Yeah, well, you'd be surprised. Okay. But it was in Stockholm, in Sweden, and this was a group of classification officers or heads of classification boards, or all kinds of titles. And I was talking to effectively my peers from all over the world, and as I introduced myself, I realised that every now and again one of them would take an involuntary step back. As I said, "Hi, I'm kia ora, I'm chief censor from Aotearoa," and at the mention of the word censor, there was almost an involuntary twitch or a spasm or a half step back. I was actually presenting at that conference, and at the start of my presentation, I introduced myself and said, "Look, it's interesting. Something I've picked up on conversations around the place is that very few of you're all involved in censorship in some way, shape, or form, but the title chief censor or censorship doesn't seem to feature. Can I just do a poll and ask how many people have a chief censor, or how many people have censorship in the official name of their office?" And one hand went up out of quite a number at the conference, and this was a representative from Singapore, I think it was. And she said, "But we're going to change our title next year." But
is that anything to do, as we all have a look at the Twitter feed for your office, is that anything to do with what it's called the NZ Classification Office? Is that part of the transition away from, don't be scared of my censorship?
Yeah, look, it's a really interesting thing because the reality is I think there's more censorship going on around the world than ever before. But there's less visibility of who's doing it, how they're doing it, and according to what kind of rules and principles. And I think that's an issue, actually.
You think more censorship is an issue?
I think it's an issue that it's hidden, that it's not clear.
Right.
Who's censoring what and according to what kind of principles. And I think there's a real issue there that I'd love to have an opportunity to unpack. We've got a bit of time to talk about
Time for that.
But look, just stepping back in terms of what my your original question, what's the spec? What's a day in life?
Card,
yeah. Effectively, as chief censor, I'm responsible under the charmingly named Films, Videos and Publications Classification Act, with running an office. And I've got a small office called the Classification Office, which has two main functions essentially. And the one main function is what I would describe as commercial work classification. So this is cinema release films.
Right.
Also physical media films, so titles that come over on DVDs and the like.
So not to big screen.
Yes, to big screen. So cinema release, movies going to the big screen. Other films that have bypassed the big screen and gone straight to DVD.
Yeah, what we used to call straight to video.
Yeah, exactly. So those titles, in order to be sold, or in order to be shown at cinemas, or in order to be sold or rented, needed to be classified if they hit certain thresholds, and that's what my office primarily does on the commercial side. So the mainstream movies that are released in the cinemas, many of those are cross-rated against what we call cross-rated against Australia or UK classifications. So if the Australians give a big title a G or a PG or an M rating, then it gets cross-rated against that rating and released here in New Zealand on that classification.
So just for clarity, when you say cross-rated, we just use their...
We just
say, our brothers across the ditch have said it's this, I'm comfortable that we'll just take their rating.
That's
so you
right.
don't physically have to watch that?
That we don't, unless there's particular reasons to. And
Well, does that mean
similarly for the UK...
Doesn't that mean you wouldn't watch any big screen film then? Because surely everything that shows here shows over there.
Well, but then you've got the restricted films, the R13s, R16, right. R18s. All of those films with those classifications have been reviewed, and that classification has been applied by my office, basically.
So the ones in Australia that might be more family friendly, the P's, the G's and the PGs from Australia, you'll just take that. But if it's anything more serious, even if they've given it an R13, your office will still watch it to double check.
That's right.
Gotcha.
And part of the reason for that is that once you get beyond the G's and the PGs and the M's, the classification regimes start diversifying. So, for example, Australia doesn't have an R13.
Right.
It doesn't have an R16
right.
as such. It has what they call an MA15 plus, which is a composite of a whole bunch of age restriction classifications, and they've got an equivalent of our R18. But the point is, at that level, it's been recognised historically. There's particular potential harms, impactful scenes in cinema, and there's different standards and thresholds that apply in different societies, and that's accepted kind of across the world in terms of an approach.
If we look at those harms, I think I read on a bio around your TED Talk, sex, crime, cruelty, horror, violence, are those sort of the things you look at and justify what the harms may be? Yeah,
they're called the gateway criteria in our Act. So essentially, in order to restrict access, so putting an age restriction on a film is restricting access, and in a way it's an impingement upon freedom of access to information. So in order to justify that, we have to be pointing to or basing the assessment on there might be a harm, or there could manifestly be a harm, particularly to younger viewers, and how can we apply a regime around that. So that's kind of one half, if you like, of what my office does.
So that half is basically what we see as big media content, easily accessible through movie or television or DVD. You guys are checking all that out for us.
Well, it gets more complicated than that, because when you talk about television, then you're talking about the Broadcasting Standards Authority.
Right, the BSA.
So
the toothless BSA.
Well, here's the thing about media regulation. as a whole, here in this country and in most countries around the world, to be honest, we have a patchwork quilt of regulators who are really operating upon a basis and an understanding of media that dates back to the 80s. So my Act's 1993, Broadcasting Standards Act, I think, is 1989. We've got Media Council, which was the Press Council, which had, you know, some of its origins also back in time. So
But the Advertising Standards Authority, ASA, is that kind of part of that group?
Advertising Standards Authority,
yep.
Absolutely, also a critical piece of the regulatory
yep.
patchwork puzzle, and you could point to the Electoral Commission as well as
okay.
having certain obligations and certain aspects of media, and in particular ads or content impinging upon electoral processes. So, you know, you've got a range of authorities. The office that I run is one. And effectively through the middle you've got digital media, which is regulated partially or not at all, depending on kind of what digital media you're talking about and mm-hmm. what the content is. So here's where it gets interesting, because the other half of what my office does is what we would call the dark side, which is Crown referrals of potentially unlawful material.
So I think we can use a really obvious example of that, which was Christchurch, the massacre.
Which was Christchurch.
I'm intrigued why you guys watched that and why you're needed to ban that, because I think the world would know that that's a crime. So you're not, I'm assuming that you're not needed to justify, is this a crime? Yeah, so when it's not something that's obviously for commercial purpose, yeah, explain that to us. We can use that because everyone knows that one, so that might be a really easy one.
Yeah, look, and that's absolutely right. That is, everyone does know that. That's a very visible aspect of what we do, mm-hmm. which is normally not something that's spoken about extensively in the media or discussed or, you know, kind of commonly known. So, so why was I and my office kind of involved in that process? Well, here's the thing. It's actually not immediately obvious to the law as to what is and isn't unlawful in terms of what I would call terrorist promotional or promotion of extreme violence content is. That's what the Christchurch video was an obvious postcard for hate and terror and
so does that mean that maybe that's not a good one to talk about because it seems clearer than something that might be a bit more grey area, like as an example to what we're talking about?
I mean, because here's the thing about kind of what is and isn't criminal in terms of media and publications around the world. There is a reasonably broad consensus around material involving, say, child sexual exploitation material. Mm-hmm. That's, you know, we work closely with law enforcement around the world, particularly UK and Australia and the US, in terms of identifying and where required classifying and prosecuting where required people who produce and distribute and deal in that kind of material. Once you're outside of that frame, though, there is much less consensus internationally about what is and isn't acceptable, particularly when you're talking about material that falls into the terror or extreme violence category. So that's partly why when Christchurch occurred, mm-hmm. There was a need to put that really beyond out, refer that to me in my office, and I felt it really important, given that we had, you know, the other unusual aspect of Christchurch was, of course, this was a objectionable, horrific publication that went viral. Mm-hmm. It was seen by probably thousands of New Zealanders. I've heard reports of school children in Christchurch lying on the floor in lockdown in school on their devices, having the live stream video kind of promoted to them or recommended on social media. So what happened post Christchurch was you had a horrific event, the terrorist broadcast live streaming it, knowing that he had followers who were going to be putting that up on social media platforms. And then it seemed that he probably also appreciated that engagement with that material would trigger the algorithms on social media platforms to amplify it and spread it and promote it, which is exactly what happened. So that's unusual. When you're dealing with illegal content, typically defined, you're not typically dealing with content that triggers that kind of viral amplification on social media platforms. That did. But that was also why it was critically important that we had an official assessment and some official messaging about, let's be clear here. This is an unlawful product. You shouldn't be distributing it. You shouldn't be sharing it. You certainly shouldn't be sending it around. If you've got it, you should delete it. And that message came through really clearly, and people kind of, I think, understood that really, really quickly and got them behind that. But in other countries, the live stream video is not and may not be unlawful and objectionable. I'm
interested as well. I got sent the manifesto when that happened by contact. I never actually looked at it. I would have read it as a point of, someone in the media who would have commentated on. I would have read what he'd written, but it was in my Facebook inbox, and then it was gone. So obviously Facebook had made that. Well, I guess what I'm wondering is, even though maybe, as I said, it's the wrong example to talk about because it's such an obvious crime, what I guess I hear you saying, tell me if I'm wrong, is for action to be taken, there needs to be an official, shall we say, declaration from your office to say this is technically, breaking all our standards. Therefore, it's illegal. Now, Facebook, you can action it because we have declared it. So now, is that sort of so? It's kind of giving it even though it's obvious to us, which is why I was saying maybe another example might be better to talk about. It gives it the tick for all the other groups to action what they need to. Is that sort of why you need to see it?
That's sort of why.
Right.
Particularly in this space where things are ambiguous and we don't have a relatively clear understanding across the system.
But we're not saying Christchurch is ambiguous. That's not an ambiguous one.
We're not saying Christchurch is ambiguous.
Can you give us an example of maybe, I don't know whether you can't talk about it because it's been censored, but can you give us a small example quickly of something that might be a bit more ambiguous?
Oh, look, we deal with matters in the grey all the time, and particularly so in this sort of area in terms of terror promotion. So examples would be, you mentioned the manifesto, right?
Yeah.
So that was a much more less immediately obvious example of something that we did look at and also came out after the decision on the live stream video and said, hey, look, this also is an unlawful publication. And I had a number of people saying to me, well, look, why is that? We can understand the video. That's horrific and dreadful and completely beyond the pale. Understand that. But this document, why is that in the same category? I mean, that's not going to harm people who read it in the same way, and it might be useful for some people to be able to critique it and understand it, which is a point of view I entirely understand. And I would note we've also got a provision in the Act which allows us, if you approached me and said, hey, look, I'm interested in doing some research and doing a podcast from a media point of view to report on it, and we've provided multiple dispensations and allowances for people in that situation to do exactly that. But beyond that, that document, as we looked at it, matched up and ticked all the boxes for us in terms of the legal framework that we apply to extremist terrorist promotional magazines, documents, flyers from the likes of ISIS or Al-Qaeda, which had also been referred to us by law enforcement, which we had also said was objectionable, because all they are for is for promoting their cause, recruiting new followers, and giving them instructions about what kind of horrific attacks and murders and crimes that they can commit.
As you're talking, I noticed you see me writing. I write down the word radicalized. So it's the kind of, I could have read that. Still, when I say would be comfortable to read it, I don't mean comfortable with the content, but I know it wouldn't affect me. But there is a sector of society that watches a YouTube video, that reads the magazine, that sees the manifesto, is then the step towards being radicalized. So
that's right.
The ban it. It's like I can drive in my car 105 on the motorway safely, but we set a limit to keep everybody safe. That's sort of the thing.
very much the thinking and approach. And in fact, I said to people who were interviewing me in the immediate aftermath, look, this isn't going to harm you if you read it. You might be nauseated and you might be outraged and you might be upset in various ways. It's not going to harm you. But here's the thing. This thing isn't for you. It wasn't written for you. It was written very specifically for a very small audience and a very specific audience. That is the people who are on the pathway to radicalisation, who just need that extra little push that will be generated by the drama, what they would perceive as the momentousness of these events and the persuasive force of the author who was the architect of all of this and gathering all of this attention. That's the audience that this is written for, and it's not written so you can read it so you can actually understand what the motivations are and really figure out what's going on and do a bit of armchair psychoanalytics. It's not that. This is a very specific document for a very specific audience, with a very specific purpose. And I was saddened but not surprised to then see subsequently attacks in Poway, California, and El Paso, and in several other places around the world where attackers carried out racially motivated terror attacks, committing atrocities, and wrote their own documents, following a very similar format to what we'd seen before, and specifically calling out that document from the Christchurch attack as being, in one case, the most persuasive thing I've ever read.
Wow.
So, that you couldn't get a more tangible, direct link in terms of that's the sort of harm we're trying to prevent. Now, we can't prevent that harm in El Paso or Southern California or elsewhere because I don't have jurisdiction over that. And nor can we absolutely prevent that kind of harm and dissemination in this country because guess what? This thing is on the internet, and actually there's only so much that we can do in terms of enforcement and management and removal of it, but we need to do what we can. So that's the thinking about that category of document. Now, you mentioned, right, what about the grey? That is a greyer and less immediately intuitive and obvious example, and then extending out from there like ripples in a pond is, okay, well, what do we think about the documents produced by these killers in America or in Europe? Should they also be objectionable under the same kind of framework that we apply?
What about, let me ask you this question, because I don't know too much about the story floating around the internet at the moment, but some basically unsuccessful right-wing author in New Zealand said something bad about Nanaia Mahuta's moko. I saw it today, and there is a lot of defence going up from her at the moment because she was banned from a if someone's got fewer Twitter followers than me, then they've got no presence at all, because I've got no presence and I've got more Twitter followers than them, which is nothing, right? So they're obviously someone who's not successful in what they do either. But there was an interesting point being made that the bookseller, and obviously it was a choice of censorship, the bookseller chose to remove her book, but then someone was saying, but hang on, they listed a bunch of all these mass murderers and people who have written books from historical situations, that books were still being supplied by that bookseller. Now, this is not maybe a censorship thing from your office, but that comes to me of the idea of maybe grey area or maybe a relativity. Like, what's the relative nature by bringing in censorship? And I always think about a particular family group in New Zealand that claims to be always about the family, yet they don't support same-sex marriage, and they want to smack kids. And I'm like, well, you scream from the rooftop that everything you're doing for families, but if the parents are gay, you want to take their kids away. So, you don't want them to be married, and if they and you think they should be able to hit their kids. So there's a relativity. So in other words, it's we are about families that want to smack their kids and that want to be straight. So they're not actually about families. They're about a selective number of families. I was thinking about that today, thinking about the censorship thing. The relativity to it from your office, or maybe from within society, as to then who decides where is the line, what is maybe abhorrent to someone is not to someone else, and how does the office, and I guess I'm asking more generally about society, look at that issue and what to do about what offends you doesn't offend me, or what you find violent I don't, and who, because someone has to make that. Like, do you get an R13 because there's 13 fucks in this movie, and they say the word cunt in that movie, so there better be an R16 and full frontal in that one. So how do we do it? Yeah.
Well, look, starting at your final comment first, because there's a lot in there.
Sorry,
but no, it's all good stuff. I mean, I think once upon a time the BBFC did actually count up how many swear words and what sort of level they were at to hit certain thresholds. That's something we've never done. And I think, I don't know, I think as a New Zealand culture, we're less likely to be harmed by bad language than perhaps some other as a general sense. So, there's standards and all the rest, but I think we can be realistic about that sort of stuff. But the point that you raise about booksellers removing books in the face of kind of potentially offensive or
someone
comments.
Being offended. Yeah.
Someone being offended. See, that's super interesting. I saw that unfold as well, and thought that was interesting. It's nothing to do with my office. That's a commercial decision by a private company who are looking to kind of balance all kinds of intangibles about kind of their reputation and what they might personally think. I don't know. But here's the key thing from my point of view in terms of thinking about the system. There's constant nudges and corrections in society about what is and isn't acceptable every day, all the time, from all kinds of directions, from social disapproval, from telling your uncle he's a racist when he makes inappropriate comments at the dinner table, to the decisions made perhaps by a bookseller, to actually critical decisions being made by social media companies at the moment, and some very, very public statements. This is all part of a fabric and network of kind of correction and messaging about what is and isn't acceptable. That I'm fascinated by, and increasingly think I need to understand in terms of managing my responsibility, which is applying a state sanction, right? So when I'm applying a formal classification to a film that says, hey, no one under the age of 18 can see this film, I'm very conscious that is cutting across the rights of some teenagers who might be really interested in this film and could get something out of it. And that's something I'm always mindful of in terms of the balance that's got to be struck here, in terms of going, okay, where's the public good here? What's the right balance point? And increasingly, I'm always reminded this is always about balance. And it's a dynamic balance, and it's sometimes a very difficult balance, and a difficult balance point to find. But the thing is, you're never going to find the balance point around extremist material or terrorist material or extreme hatred if you're just relying on me and the powers of the state to imprison someone who's produced something or is distributing something. Because by the time you're getting to that level of kind of discourse and publication and material, it's feeling to me like you've already lost the war, right? So
you get these pushes from all sides, and I was going to ask you, does that mean, in general, does your office influence society? Does your society influence the office? Maybe there's a bit of both. Maybe both. It's more like a yin and a yang. Or remember those things in the 80s that everyone had on their desk, the tick, 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 the balls that swing backwards and forwards? Is that kind of, you would look to what's acceptable? Because obviously what's acceptable today on our television and our movies would have been an X-rated movie in the 1960s. So that would be society finding that acceptable, which I assume would mean the society influencing your office. Yeah. But vice versa, when you draw a line in the sand under the manifesto or the more grey area thing, that's your office saying to society, this is not acceptable.
Yeah, exactly. So society shifts, right? So, but it's shifting faster and potentially more unpredictably in this sort of space than I think ever before. I think technology is driving that, right? So how do I and my office somehow even attempt to keep pace with that, because you're right, like The Graduate, when it came out in, what was it, 69? Late 60s? Yeah. That was R18. That was an R18 publication. And the funny thing about the classification system is it assumes that's it. Once you've got an official classification from me or my office, that's it in perpetuity. So when I arrived, actually, as Chief Censor a bit over 3 years ago, someone was actually applying, going, hey, look, The Graduate's still R18 in this country.
Really?
Yeah. It hadn't been reviewed. There's provisions to review, and I'm going, okay, well, let's have a look at that, because it had been subsequently re-rated in Australia to an M, which is the right sort of level.
That sounds like there's
days.
another whole division coming up in your office, which is the current movies, and the other stuff, and then the back catalogues.
Well, there's there's some interesting things coming up there in terms of the streaming space and the Netflixes and the like, which I might be able to touch on, but just to think, or just to talk about how we're thinking about keeping pace in tracking shifts in society and kind of navigating this increasingly complex media world. There's various ways that I think we can do that, and we're getting quite kind of intentional about it. One of them is we've set up a youth advisory panel, which is a crew of a dozen teenagers, basically.
Wow.
Young people aged between 16, 19, who we use as a sounding board, a reference group. They're increasingly important in terms of helping us figure out where should we be paying attention, how should we be thinking about things. Actually, the things that they find potentially harmful, or that they're telling us that they need some warnings around, or at least a bit of a heads up around, and not necessarily the things that we obviously that we would default to using a standard classification approach. So there's great insight that can be just driven off talking and deeply talking to and understanding and listening to young people. Beyond that, we have, besides the kind of commercial half of our work and our Crown kind of criminal content half of our work, there's kind of a third half of our work, which is our research function. So we've got a mandated legislative research function, and increasingly we're finding that absolutely a powerful function to use to, again, dive deeply into subject matter and talk and understand young people, talk with and understand young people, to help figure out how we can get a more intelligent, more evolved system approach. And an example of that most recently is we surveyed, it was over 2,000, I think that's right, 14 to 17-year-olds. It's about 1% of the 14 to 17-year-olds cadre in this country we surveyed, talking to them and asking them about their experiences around online pornography.
Right.
Because it was like, well, we occasionally still get adult DVDs referred to the office for classification. Yeah,
they still exist.
Yep, occasionally, but obviously that's a whole industry that's essentially moved, online, into an unregulated space. And so, from my point of view, it's like, well, okay, I'm a media regulator tasked with responsibilities to keep people safe, and in particular young people safe. But here's a whole area of content that we know is being consumed by young people that we don't have any baselines about, we don't have any appreciation. Nobody's actually spoken to young people in any in-depth way. So we've actually conducted 3 research reports. The first was a nationwide survey, getting a sense of scope, scale, frequency, an initial sense of how they felt about that, what sort of issues they were seeing with it. We did some content research looking at the top 200 clips most viewed by New Zealanders on Pornhub, to get a sense of, okay, well, how's the industry evolving and shifting and morphing in terms of what's popular pornographic content these days. And then most recently, earlier this year, we put out a deep dive qualitative study where we were interviewing young people in depth about what they really thought was problematic about this. Some of the insights from them about, look, many of them were telling us, look, it worries me that I'm treating this as my primary source of information about sex, and I know my peer group is doing the same. And what does that mean in terms of expectations or kind of understanding about what sex is? This is a problem, and nobody's talking about it. This is the other thing that increasingly comes through as we talk to young people, is there's always been a generation gap in this. There's always been a generation gap. There's always been a generation gap in this kind of area. But that gap now seems to be a chasm because, of course, we're all on our individual screens. And the average age of getting a smartphone in this country is around about 12 these days. It's going down every year. So everyone is on their own device, consuming their own content and not talking about their experiences or things that are problematic or things that have impacted them. And that's a huge issue, and it's an issue that's not going away. And we think the only way you can bridge that is not by doing more of our traditional kind of classification and labelling work, although providing the right sort of levels of warning and upfront kind of information to people is part of it. But we need to do much more than that. We need to broker conversations. We need to provide tools and information, and really change the whole scene.
As a parent, when you're doing that research, like research into porn especially, like when you saw what the kind of top 5 clips were, I don't know, obviously I don't know what they are. Did you release that information? Could one see what they were into? Or was it more for you internally?
Look,
what I was going to say is I wonder if was it like, something crazy weird that, a fetish video or a pain video, like kind of outside the realms of what would be considered. I mean, to have a top 5 for teenagers watching porn anyway feels kind of weird on some levels. But even from what I guess one would classify as, normal kind of sex, was it crazy out there stuff that you were surprised by, or?
There were certainly surprises. So, the most, well, probably by some calculations, the most popular commercial site is known as Pornhub. There's various kind of different takes on it, and it's a very, very opaque industry, as you can probably imagine. But what Pornhub. I mean, look. First of all, to give you a sense of the scale of these companies, who do you think is the biggest consumer of internet bandwidth in the world?
I remember seeing this on QI, and people were talking about it's the most information out there goes to spam email. And I think that they said porn was by far and away bigger than that. And this year it's bigger even still because of lockdown.
Yeah, but if you're thinking about a business or a corporation that's consuming worldwide global bandwidth,
so it's the businesses that are using it for their business.
Yeah. It's obvious when I tell you it's Google, it's Alphabet, right?
Sure.
And the big bandwidth consumer, really, out of most of their services is YouTube. There's 500 hours of content going up on YouTube every minute. But then beyond that, next I think, and again, there's various different calculations that can be applied. But number 2, by many calculations, would be Netflix. Netflix is in nearly 200 countries around the world.
Facebook will be up there, I would assume.
Facebook's up there, but apparently MindGeek is ahead of Facebook. MindGeek, who's MindGeek?
Yeah.
MindGeek own Pornhub.
Right.
And they own about 50,000 other adult sites.
There is a documentary that I haven't seen, but I've heard talked about on the Joe Rogan podcast, actually, about a particular gentleman in America who went and started buying up all the small porn places, and maybe it's the guy who owns MindGeek, and then amalgamated, and now he's basically the big daddy, pardon the pun, of all the porn world, and he kind of owns all of them.
Yeah, there's an amazing podcast called The Butterfly Effect, which actually kind of talks about the massive kind of digital takeover of the industry and how that worked, and it's interesting in many respects because it provides a bit of a preview of kind of what's happening more broadly in media in some respects, but the thing is, it's a massively popular site, massively popular industry. Huge numbers and stats run out of Pornhub, which is just one of many thousands of sites. if you go on to that and its big competitors, they operate like a big social media platform. They're very sophisticated. They've got a lot of money, and using very similar kind of tech internet playbooks to keep people engaged, keep people coming back, doing all of those things. And one of the things that Pornhub provides is a kind of slice and dice functionality where you can actually go, look, I want to see the most popular viewed clips in New Zealand today over the last 24 hours, or over the last week, or ever.
Wow.
Or you can slice and dice it any way you like. It's all part of the free and useful functionality. So it's interesting from a research point of view, because you can literally get a sample and go, and you'd go, well, is that reliable? Can you trust these guys? And there's some international studies where they've kind of done some checks, spoken to the people operating the systems, and gone, well, it's about as reliable as you're going to get, and it's a very useful data set and insight into what's trending, what's being promoted, what are people viewing, and getting right back to your initial question, well, is it what is popular? The amazing thing to me, and I would stress it's not just popular in New Zealand, it seems to be very popular across many countries, is a hugely popular kind of genre or topic is step porn. So
stepmom, stepsister,
stepmom, stepdad, step uncle, stepbrother. I think we had well over half the most popular clips had some element of
now. Just to reiterate,
in it.
This is when you were talking to young people as well.
Well, this is part of our suite of research,
right?
But yeah, young people obviously are going to the same format. This is what they're seeing. This is known to be, for some reason, a very, very popular kind of setup framing genre in porn.
I mean, we're talking about the digital realm now, because you talked about the kind of commercial movies, that sort of thing. You're talking about research and the digital realm. Like what we're doing right now is in the digital realm. And often I talk about, Broadcasting Standards Authority. I worked in radio for 20 years, so I know them well enough. Toothless monsters. They basically are, for people who don't know, you hear about the word authority and you think, they got control. It's basically radio stations choose to belong to it. The authority makes a ruling. The radio stations don't have to follow it if they don't want. They're recommendations. So really, it's like it's not even a slap on the wrist, because it doesn't have to be anything. But there's nothing on the internet. So when I have people coming on here, often we talk about language, and people ask if they, can I swear? And I'm like, well, there's no real there are no standards at all on the internet. Obviously, there's laws of the land. If you come on here and defame someone, they could sue me, but actually you can do whatever you want as long as it's within the realms of legal content. And so things like Pornhub, they're in the digital world as well. But how does your office, how does the chief censor approach those things? The internet is really the Wild West. And is there a way, is there something that we could do here in this podcast? No, I don't mean literally do, but this hypothetically, that would be something that could get referred to the chief censor, that could involve you having to censor it. Is it actually possible? So
that's a really interesting question. And is it possible? It sure is.
Really?
It sure is. Absolutely. Is that likely? Would it be the kind of thing that we'd have to go down, let's say the white supremacy rule, and start giving out our own handbooks, and that could get it banned? That's right. So if we started, here's where it gets really interesting in terms of kind of how my act is architected and how it works, because essentially what we're doing now is we're operating in the digital realm, as you say. We're producing a podcast. Awesome. That podcast is, in my act's eyes, that is a publication. Mm-hmm. So a publication in my act is anything that has audio, video, words, images, pretty much anything. So according to my act, a wicked camper van that has a cartoon on the side of it is a publication.
Wow.
Even though that seems counterintuitive. It is, because it ticks the boxes. It's a publication in my act is an extremely broad thing, and includes digital recordings.
So just before you move on, I remember the stories around the wicked camper vans and some slogans that were deemed offensive. Was your office involved with that, or was so you were involved because there were some that were banned for want of better, wasn't there?
Well, what? Yeah, there's quite a detailed backstory around the wicked camper vans, some of which predates my involvement. But essentially, my involvement was with some camper vans involving cartoon characters, obviously taking Class A drugs. So I think there was one that I recall involving Snow White, clearly
using
snorting meth or cocaine or something of that kind. And I classified that as I would kind of an adult comic at a R16 level, I think, from memory, which isn't banning it. It isn't putting it in that extreme level of something that's absolutely unlawful. But I was going, you know what, this imagery, if it was in a magazine, I'd and I was asked to age classify it, I'd age restrict it, because you don't want kids kind of exposed to that kind of low-level promotional,
But then what do you do when that camper van is on the road?
Well, it can't. The effect is it can't be on the road.
So in other words, only people who are 16 are allowed to see this vehicle as it drives down the road. So that immediately takes it off the road.
The practical effect is it's very difficult to drive that thing around in public and on the road. So that's where that kind of got to. But but back to the point in terms of the digital sphere.
Yeah, so we're in the digital sphere.
Could this recording,
any publication?
Yeah.
Yep.
Could this recording be referred to me if for example, we started espousing white supremacist hatred and talking about kind of terrorist promotional material? Then absolutely, in theory, law enforcement or a member of the public could refer that. Draw my attention to that and say, I think this should be classified. I think that should be deemed objectionable or unlawful, or at least needs a look at. So that here's the interesting thing from my point of view. Under my act, I can call in publications that I think might be injurious to the public good.
Mm-hmm.
And given what I've just said about how broad a publication is defined as, that means in theory I could call in and classify the internet.
Crumbs. Mind blown.
Which obviously would be a labour of Hercules and beyond impossible to do, regardless of how big. But the interesting thing for me is, okay, so I'm mandated to provide some kind of protection to society. I can literally reach out and go, I think this is injurious, I'm going to classify it. How do I use that power intelligently and in a worthwhile way that gets us ahead, rather than just creates a rod for my back and generates classifications and unlawful publications that nobody knows about?
Did we see a little bit of that with the Christchurch massacre? Because I know there's a website called LiveLeak, and I visit LiveLeak maybe once a month, because there's some interesting videos on there. But I do know it was the place back in the day you could see the beheading videos, and then they chose to stop doing that. And I think that when the ban came in for that video, the country blocked LiveLeak, and so you couldn't get LiveLeak in New Zealand. When you say you put the internet on trial, or the words you used, is that the kind of thing you could actually go out there and say, actually, I can see Pornhub being a danger, sex, crime, cruelty, horror, violence, and that could be, your office could be used to then ban Pornhub from New Zealand servers? Is that the kind of way?
Well, that's
in theory.
Yeah. Look, well, that's the interesting thing about what does the classification mean in terms of enforcement, and that's getting into, okay, how does this actually work? And how do we make things better rather than potentially aggravate things? So the interesting thing about LiveLeak getting cut off from New Zealand servers was that was essentially New Zealand ISPs, so New Zealand internet service providers, who operate effectively the internet and internet supply and connection for New Zealanders. When they saw what was going down with this video going viral, they went, we have to do something about this.
So was it
this
them
is
that
going
did
out
that?
of control? Yeah, that's right.
Do you know what that raises? And that raises a really interesting question, and maybe we're seeing this in America at the moment. I want my freedom, don't tread on me. is your office even necessary, or because that's society regulating itself? Is there an argument to be had?
If you go back to the ISPs and talk to them now, they say we never want to be in that position again.
Right.
It shouldn't be us, and I think they're right. They were doing the right thing. That's all power, and in fact, I gave them credit.
So that wasn't a mandate from your office.
That wasn't a mandate from the office.
Wow.
That was in the crucible of the response. It was people trying to figure out how to limit the damage and distribution of this thing, and so they made some brave calls. But the conversation is now, look, how can we have this kind of managed? How can we kind of anticipate that this could happen again? God forbid that it ever does. But we are seeing other attacks and other attempts to live stream similar horrific things, which we're not immune from over here. How can we think about, as a system, the right sort of roles and responsibilities, so you're not having that weight of that responsibility coming down on private companies? So that's a very live and ongoing conversation, but it opens out into the much bigger global conversation that's happening right now about, well, what is social media's responsibility? If it's the algorithms that is promoting and magnifying and propelling this material across their platforms, what is their responsibility around that?
Well, let me just say this. It seems that from this conversation, the determination that I've come to, and I'm probably wrong and oversimplifying it, but there seems to be kind of three forms of censorship we're talking about. The first is, let's say, your office or an equivalent body, which is kind of saying this is official, it's from on high, this is what we decide. The second is companies, ISPs doing it. And what we're seeing at the moment, if I bring it up for people watching, is Donald Trump being censored on his Twitter feed. When we look right here, they've allowed the statement to go out. We have claimed for electoral vote purposes, in other words, for me winning, the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania, which won't allow legal observers. Anyway, it says the statement, and then there's a tag from Twitter saying official sources have not called the race when this was tweeted, and that's happened 3 or 4 times. There's one here that's not. You can't even see it. You have to click into the tweet to actually then go to see what it is. So that would be a company doing a form of censorship. And I guess that's them saying for the betterment, which again perhaps is relative. But the third form, and I think we haven't talked about this, and this is perhaps another form, is like, or maybe we have because we talked about the bookstore. It's like it's the bookstore, but more for an ideology. Like we hear about the cancel culture and the pylons happening at the moment. Someone says something that's not illegal, that's not dangerous, but is just deemed offensive by a sector. And then there's a pylon, often on social media. And then that causes that person to lose work, to lose money, to lose whatever it is. So there seems to be three kind of, there's probably far more than that.
Look, I think you're absolutely getting it in terms of breaking this very complex situation down. You've got state regulated responsibilities and roles, right? And that's going to be always around law. That's what I represent, and I have to operate according to the law. And essentially, I have a number of tools. Quite limited tools in the face of kind of the challenges that we have in a digital environment, but I have a number of tools that can be applied and need to be applied very, very sparingly and consciously, because they do impact on the rights.
But if I think about your office, and we talk about the legality and the law, it's the law coming to you on some level and saying, is this too far? And it's you going to the law saying, hey guys, this is too far. But your office seems to have the connection directly to making something or confirming that something is illegal, rather than offensive, just offending someone.
That's right. We get referred stuff all the time that is deeply offensive, horrific, horrible, awful, abominable, but not illegal in the sense that it's going to create the kind of manifest harm that we're looking for, that actually merits the sort of sanction of the state that we're talking about. So increasingly I find myself thinking about that span that you outlined. You've got us operating in that sphere. but that in and of itself is manifestly insufficient. It's an important part of a composite. The other critical part of the composite is exactly what you're pointing out here in terms of platforms, companies, industry operators, social media companies, applying their own terms of use and kind of responsibility to run a reasonably safe and civil ship, right? And so the standards that Twitter are applying and the standards that Facebook apply and so on are not at the level, not at the threshold that I, my office would apply for something that's illegal. They can set their kind of pointer pretty much anywhere they like in terms of what they will and won't tolerate. And effectively, when you sign up to their platform, that's what you're signing up to.
The terms and conditions. The difficulty with that is you get some of these platforms, and probably if you want to look at the three of them, maybe not Facebook because the next generation finds that to be of the old people, as my daughter told me the other day, but certainly Twitter, certainly YouTube, sort of have a monopoly in that area. And then the conversation comes in, and there are many making at the moment, when does it become sort of a public right or a public good, even though they're private companies? Because, we could talk about Alex Jones on YouTube getting banned because he said some offensive things, and some were. Did he break any laws? I've watched a podcast with the two top people from Twitter talking about why certain people had been banned, and none of it was for law breaking. And then, of course, the opposing view kind of goes, but hang on, just because you didn't like it doesn't mean that there's anything wrong with it. So then we've sort of got people who are making relative decisions. And so then the thing that's nice about The Office is there's quite an easy line. When I say easy, I mean easily observable line when you go breaking a legal standard.
Yep.
Any other kind of censorship, even if we go straight away like the massacre in the ISPs, I don't think there'd be many people, although you probably heard from some, but many normal people in New Zealand that would have disagreed with that. But then you're going to, the further down that line you go, the further area of greys there are.
Yeah.
And that's the conversation where you get the kind of accusations of left-wing bias or of, whatever, I don't know, patriarchy or whatever the particular group arguing with the other side is.
Yeah. That's right. See, what we have when you're dealing with a state regulator, such as I am operating according to legislation, then part of the deal with conferring powers and the ability to make determinations under the law to me in my office is I have to do that transparently, and I have to be held to account. So if you don't agree with, if this podcast gets referred to me and I classify it and you go, no, that sucks, that's completely mental.
It'd be good publicity for me though. We should definitely do that.
Yeah. But you can then go directly to a board of review that sits over my office, and then if you don't like that, then you can appeal it. You've got a pathway, and it's reasonably accessible. It's not perfect, but it's reasonably accessible to go, no, I don't agree, let's test that, and it's tested according to very transparent kind of principles and applications of the law, right? That's good. If you don't agree with what Twitter's doing or Facebook, good luck with that.
Yeah.
Right? That's part of the issue.
And we've heard that from dozens, if not hundreds of people going, I've been banned, I've said I didn't do that, and I've got no recourse.
Yeah, so they know they've got a problem in this space, and the problem is getting untenable for them, frankly. All of this that we're seeing in connection with the posts that you're talking about and the whole discourse around actually what really is going on with the polarization, the hate speech, the levels of antipathy that we're seeing, around the world, particularly in the US at the moment, and how can we hold social media companies that have such incredible power that is being manipulated, and it's known as being manipulated by various actors and various individuals who are using them as a mouthpiece for all kinds of potentially dangerous ideas and hatred. How can we have the right level of transparency, accountability, in that system, and that's hugely challenging given the size of these companies, given where they're based, given their grounding as well in terms of the legislation that they essentially navigate to in the US.
Well, and the reason it's challenging for them is ultimately it's likely to come back to a person. Now, that might be the same as your office when you're doing a movie. It might ultimately come back to a person, but whether a movie is an R16 or an R18 is not really going to change the face of the earth. But banning someone or something, or maybe even more so, allowing a COVID comment to go out by Donald Trump, Twitter comes back to a person. If that person then allows it, that could make a huge difference, because it really depends on that singular person's ideology, even whether they think it's offensive or not offensive, fair or not fair. Free speech, which we haven't even talked about, because I think the idea of free speech is sort of nonsense. I think the truth is we have some free speech. We don't just have free speech as an absolute. And I think that's the same for every country, including America, although they would disagree. There are some free speeches, there are some limitations. And whatever that person decides is then determining what, if anything, is getting censored.
Well, they're potentially wielding enormous power, particularly when you're talking about decisions in relation to people with enormous influence and bandwidth and tremendous number of followers. And that's why you're also seeing that there's some evidence that these big platforms are not allowing that to happen. They're not allowing. They've got tens of thousands of content moderators. That Facebook has tens of thousands of they call them moderators. They're censors in some respects, but they would not allow one of their moderators to make some of these critical calls that we're talking about in terms of making assessments about statements by world leaders, for example. Those decisions are wrapping up an enormous amount of kind of senior management bandwidth and wraparound in real time as they're working through some of these critical calls. But they're struggling. They're struggling in this space because, it's not their core business. They just want to get on and make money with, kind of increasing engagement, getting more followers and selling people stuff they don't need. That's, their business model is relatively simple. They don't want to be distracted by all of this stuff. But the fact is, they are massive bandwidth media companies creating with, dealing with unimaginable volumes of content, some of which is harmful. And they have a responsibility operating that kind of industry to recognise that's the reality and manage it safely.
And maybe not many people have done or seen or witnessed this before. I had a guest once not in the studio, but in my studio, who was one of the people who's been banned on Twitter. Her name's Megan Murphy. Quite controversial. She said something about the transgender community, which I don't want to get into. But I had for her, and I can show this to people, I won't play the volume, but I had her in studio, and she was talked about on the Joe Rogan podcast, often gets talked about on the Joe Rogan podcast. And the interesting thing is, on the Joe Rogan podcast, she was talked about by Jack Dorsey from Twitter and from one of the heads of the moderators as to why she was banned. They were like, this is why we banned her. These are the strikes she got. And she was sitting there watching it. So I had Megan Murphy watching Jack Dorsey talk about why Megan Murphy was banned. Yeah. And she was like, that never happened. That never happened. That never happened. That's not true. That's not true. So that's Tim Pool. He's a journalist as well. But he explained the Megan Murphy situation. And this is the lady who's one of the head of the moderators. And Jack was there as well. And yeah, it was really interesting just to see. I mean, I don't want to get into the conversation with anyone about the content that she was banned for, each to their own, that sort of thing. But having someone literally watching the people who were responsible for banning her, explaining why they were banning her, and she was saying that wasn't the case. So, it's like, that's the Wild West.
Yeah, that's right. And it needs sorting out. And increasingly you're seeing even the likes of Mark Zuckerberg coming out saying unimaginable things compared with a few years ago, basically saying, actually, you know what, we need to be regulated. that's where we're at.
Well, that's the thing. It's just like the telephone, the telephones back in the day. Everyone had them installed in their houses, and if you lived the furthest away from everybody else, you got a party line, but the government still had to get a line to you to install it. That's where kind of some of these social medias are turning into, and that's the conversation. If the President of the United States, and Sean Spicer said this in the first few weeks he was involved, didn't last long, but he said if it's a tweet from the President, it's an official White House document. So therefore, he can't ban you from following him. You can't be banned in America from following the president. And there's been lawsuits making him unban people if that is an official White House source of information. And much of that is happening following on. I don't know if it's the same with Jacinda here, but she's obviously got a Facebook page. If that's deemed an official path, then surely they can't ban anyone. So when does it become a public right?
And that is part of the complexity and the challenge of all of this. There is a public interest in what these people are saying, and you know what? I think things, in some respects, are getting better as the system kind of understands where we can be led astray or where problems can arise. And I seriously think that news organisations are kind of increasingly getting their head around some of the issues of this. I think the reporting in this country through the COVID crisis and some of the responses to some of the serious disinformation and some of the really problematic messaging that's arisen throughout 2020, I think there's many things that we can look at about how the system has responded, some of the in-depth investigative journalism that's come out that is amazing work, really thorough, really accessible to New Zealanders. There's a level of kind of reasonable reportage and public discourse that seems to be happening here that you're not seeing in some other countries. And I think there's something there that is really important for us to also just be aware of and think about how we can even drive that further in terms of providing some antibodies to some of the problems we're seeing overseas. I mean, you would have been watching the US election coverage, no doubt. Yeah. You probably saw the Commander-in-Chief stand up and effectively declare victory. But then I don't know. What channel or what news service you're watching, but I happened to be watching it on CNN, and they showed that clip, that statement, and then they cut back to the newsroom and they said, well, we just need to be really clear about what's going on. That what's just been said is actually not true. That's actually misleading, and in fact what this is the state. And so you're seeing remarkable things. I mean, these are remarkable responses to remarkable times and kind of challenges, but there's something there that I think we can kind of think about and learn from in real time in terms of where's some of the safety nets and management that we're almost working out as we go along in this space.
Well, look, I could probably talk to you for another hour yet, but
listen, you're fake news.
Speaking of fake news, you're actually in Dunedin for a reason. Maybe you want to give us a couple of seconds, because I'm sure there's still tickets. I haven't spoken to Hannah today, who's responsible for this, but there is an event this afternoon. What time does it start? 5:30?
It is tonight.
Is it like 5? Oh yeah, 5:30 today at 5:30. Yep. And it's called Fake News: The Other Virus, Misinformation and Disinformation in the Age of COVID-19. You're going to be talking about this. Do you want to give us a bit of a 2-minute précis as to what this is all about and what you're going to be doing?
Yeah, look, this is a panel discussion, so I'm going to be talking to whatever gets thrown at me in the panel in terms of a discussion around fake news, misinformation, disinformation. What is it? What can we do about it? What are we seeing? Stephen Davis is involved, who I know. I know you know Stephen as well. Is very active in the space. Kate Hanna's down, who I'm really looking forward to speaking with. Another thinker in this area. I guess this is just one of the issues of the moment that we've touched on in this discussion. Interestingly, I don't have a mandate to actually censor fake news. I can't censor something because it's wrong or it's a lie. But what we're seeing in the extremist space is that there's a funnel effect with conspiracy theories that suck people into a rabbit hole of further and further disassociation.
You can't do it when they're wrong or a lie. What is the line then? Is it more that they're then active? Like if I'm wrong, but I might believe myself to be right. Is it that they have to be wrong and a lie, and they're actively trying to drive someone towards a harmful ideology? Is that sort of the line?
Are you promoting a crime? Are you saying someone should be killed for this? Are you saying this is, the effects of 5G are so serious that justifies us going out and hurting people or committing crimes and violence? And here's how you do that. So it's when it shades into we talked about the gateways before in terms of crime is one of the gateways. So that's where we get to in that space.
So when you told me that when you came in that you'd listened to the Paula Penfold piece, have you yourself personally seen that documentary she did about Billy TK?
I've touched on it. I didn't get the 3-minute kind of condensed version that she was
well, she said you wouldn't do that.
No, that's a joke.
But that's the role of the media then. That's her job. Her job is to show the lies. Your job is to ban the law breaking. Basically,
that's right.
Yeah,
and I think there's critical roles across the system for all of those perspectives, and they all have value. And increasingly, you need to think about the whole system.
This is on at, if people want to check this out, it's at the Otago Museum today at 5:30. Misinformation and disinformation in the age of COVID-19. If you want to check it out, you can indeed do that. Other than that, it's been fun. It's been great fun. I hope that we get a chance to touch base again, because I feel like we didn't even. I was thinking freedom of speech is like the biggest topic we could talk about here, and we didn't really even touch on it. Yeah. We talked around it, but we never went straight to the freedom of speech, because obviously censorship on some. There's obviously the line, isn't there, which is where censorship starts and freedom of speech stops. That's and there's going to be a legal place, which is your office. There's going to be maybe a societal place, which might be the pylons, and then there might be a corporate place, which is the businesses don't want certain things said on their platforms and things as well. So even that's going to be a debating type conversation.
Yeah, look, briefly, my take on freedom of speech is that it's an absolute critical value, but you don't have any freedom of speech if you don't have some rules.
Which means there's no freedom of speech. That's the point. If there's any, that's what I've always said. If there's any strings attached to freedom of speech, you don't have freedom of speech. Which is why I always say there's some freedom of speech. Because freedom in itself, that's like saying I'm going to free this bird, but you leave a string attached to its leg, it's not free.
There are no absolute. There are no absolute human rights. Every human right is subject to some provisos, and where it rubs up and impacts on other people's freedoms. So there's a whole other discussion there, but it's been great.
Now, am I right in saying that you on the classification website have a bit of a blog? Did I read that you had a bit of a blog?
We do.
You do some writings?
Yep.
So if people want to find out more about what's going on and more about your thoughts and stuff, the classificationoffice.govt.nz has a blog, and thoughts and stuff on there. It looks like, there's quite a few of recent times. 15th of October, 13th of October, 12th of October. Okay, so it's a very active blog.
Yeah.
People can find out there as well. And other than people coming along to see you tonight, I'm going to come along if there's still tickets left, hopefully. Thanks for coming in. It's been a whole lot of fun, and hopefully we can do it again sometime.
Yep, it's been great. Thanks for the opportunity.